Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Lilo and Stitch from 2002. Now, if you're watching this when this video comes out, you can probably guess why I ended up watching this. But if it's not obvious, the answer is that I have never watched it before, for one, as is typical with this series, but also that there is an upcoming Lilo and Stitch live action, I'm using big fucking air quotes on that, remake, which is, I'm not exactly sure when it's coming out, but man, why does Disney keep doing this? Anyway, tangent aside, let me stop that before it starts. I've never seen the original Lilo and Stitch. I have heard lots of people talk about it over the years and talk about how much they enjoy it and it's one of their favorites from their childhood, etc., etc. And I just never got around to it. There's a couple of reasons I think that may be the case, but I may dip into that discussion at some point during this video. But it's one I wanted to finally get around to watching. There aren't a huge number of Disney films from this sort of the 90s and 2000s that at this point I both want to see and have not seen. I've caught up with a lot of the ones that people have talked about, but this was still to be checked off. And I'm very happy to finally get around to it. And I'm actually a little upset that I didn't get to it sooner, because this is a really great film for a whole bunch of reasons. I think for some people this is very nostalgic, and I can understand why. But I also find it curious because it's got a lot of depth that I don't think is necessarily even fully appreciable by a child. And so to have my first experience with it as an adult with a substantial amount of life experience behind me is really interesting to see, especially in the context of the rest of cinema in general, and in particular kids cinema. I've talked a number of times on this show before about how I think it's really important for movies for kids to not be stupid, to have things they want to say and lessons to learn, and treat kids with a level of like respect and dignity and, awareness that isn't just, flashing lights on a screen, basically. And so I've been very complimentary over this series and, before that, of course, for movies that manage to do that. And I think this is kind of a diamond in the rough in that regard, especially coming out of Disney. Disney in general, my impression is that a lot of its stuff, even up to now, is not always so great at putting what I would consider to be meaningful lessons in its stories, or meaningful narrative, because I don't think it's the responsibility of every kid's piece of media to teach a lesson or something like that. But it's, when you can teach kids about the world in a way that is approachable and digestible, rather than having them experience it firsthand, especially when it comes to difficult topics, then I think that's really important and worth doing. And of course, it still needs to be entertaining as well. So my impression for a lot of Disney's catalog is that it lies much more on the side of entertainment than it does really anything else. Sometimes, on occasion, even dipping into the being bad lessons type of area. I think we've talked about that before, one thing or another. But anyway, this movie has some pretty substantial, heavy tones in it. And it's very interesting to me, the things that are not discussed, but are indirectly alluded to. I don't think I'm going to spoil this for anybody, but everybody knows, at least in passing, the vagaries of Lilo and Stitch. The idea of having a movie about a kid with dead parents, a underemployed sister who's looking after her, and child protective services or social services or whatever knocking at their door trying to tear them apart, their family apart, is pretty heavy for a kids film. And they do manage in no small part to get away with that by not really saying everything super explicitly all the time. But it's explicit enough that I think kids of not insubstantial youth, like, down to the under 10, can pick up enough of it that they're not going to necessarily get it, but they'll probably have some questions about it, which I think is kind of curious because it's a heavy topic, and I'm not sure every parent would be ready to have that discussion with their kid, but they should. I also think it represents a kind of unique portrayal of a family unit. I mean, that's sort of the whole point of the story in a non-insubstantial way. It portrays a family unit that is almost never shown in media, even in adult media. Usually if somebody's family is in a bad situation, it's played for drama, whether that's, kids or adults media. It's either played for drama or as a plot element, or, well, like and I don't mean that in a positive way necessarily, rather than being used as a framework for a discussion of other topics. So this movie does a really good job of not ignoring, but not lingering too much on the heavy topic of, hey, this family had their parents die and they're not doing super well and they're, struggling to get by. And there's an overt, but not explicit, I would say, recognition of that struggle and of poverty and, kind of ironic way, given the way the Walt Disney Company operates and how it treats lots of cultural things. Some actual very serious problems in places like Hawaii and other places that rely on tourism and often treat their local people as second-class citizens is a very weird thing if you want to unpack that part, but I think we'll skim over that for now. But it does, directly address some aspects of that, like, a governmental organization that doesn't really care about the specifics or doesn't show a lot of compassion about the specifics of a familial situation. They're more worried about the letter of the law per se than the actual way things are working out. And the same, there's a mirroring that's going on both between Lilo's family and the things going on with Stitch and his creator and the I forget the name. They only say it at the end of the movie. The alien group, galactic organization, whatever, and how they are largely, operating on a bureaucratic, heavily hierarchical structure that doesn't have a lot of compassion or nuance to the way it rules. I kind of got off track there because I was trying to talk about how it portrays family structures, because I think that's really interesting as well for a bunch of reasons. One is it's just very unusual, especially in Western media, to see a family that is not at least some version of a nuclear family. Yes, it is like implied that Lilo and her sister, who Nani, I think, they had a pretty decent life with their family before their parents died, and all that, but there were probably whatever else going on. It is in that sense a traditional family, but being open to portraying a family that is, one, struggling, and two, doesn't have traditional parental guidance in it, and has somebody who's fulfilling that role but not to the greatest ability because they are struggling in their own ways. That's unusual in a lot of media in general. It's even more unusual in kids media, and I think it's even more unusual in Disney media. Disney loves a a feel-good family thing. We're going to ignore a lot of the weird side projects and things that from like the 80s and stuff, where there's a lot of divorced parents going on in the 80s movies, in kids movies in general. That's a whole other discussion to be had. But I really enjoy the uniqueness of that portrayal. It's not very common. And I'm honestly having a hard time coming up with anything else that does it. And I'd love to see that more often, to see, portrayals of, I didn't even touch on the fact that it's portraying what seem to be, Native Hawaiians or some such thing. They're basically not a traditional white American family, which is worth noting every time it happens, especially in Disney, because they love a traditional white family. So to have a non-traditional family structure and a non-traditional and not their usual cast of skin tones is always worth noting. I think it's again not really something that's touched on directly, but it's also representative of an idea of family structure that's not solely made up for the movie, but that is reflective of a different kind of cultural attitude. Prepare for tangent for a second. Western sort of European ideas of like patrilineal identity and traditional family structure are a whole discussion unto themselves, and the way that America basically took those traditional ideas of family structure and amplified them to an almost toxic, not almost toxic, literally toxic extreme in our culture is a whole discussion unto itself. But there are a lot of other kind of ideas of family structures throughout the world that I think most people are probably, at least in, certainly in the US, when I say most people, that's the target market for this movie and many others. So that's what we're talking about here. The people who likely watch this film probably do not have a lot of idea of the idea that there are a lot of other cultures that have a lot of different ideas of family structures, and it's reflected both in culture and in language and the way you address people. There are plenty of like matrilineal societies and ideas of family that are less structured directly your your parents and yourself, and there are lots of cultures that talk about, say, like your cousins as being almost identical in every way in terms of culture and family structure to your own siblings. They're not treated as like more distant, and so it's not really addressed as much in this as much directly in the film, but Hawaiian culture does have the term ohana, which is less directly related to you and your parents and more related to a larger familial group that usually reflects like your cousins and other things, and people who have been adopted into the family and that sort of thing as well. I'm not an expert on it. I just know a little bit. And there's a lot of different variety out there, and I always like seeing, other cultural ideas reflected as well. I had another thought there. Oh, and then on top of all that, this mixing of all of the aforementioned ideas into the idea of an adopted family. And this is really, it's addressed a little bit with Stitch. It's addressed even less with the other people who basically only become part of the greater family structure right at the end in a montage sequence, which is kind of fascinating. Probably limitations in budget and writing, that sort of thing. But the idea of having portrayals of family that is not your own, that you were not born to, that sometimes the family that you had becomes lost in some way, either out of tragedy or intentionality, or you have you're born into a situation that's bad, like in Stitch's case, where the people who traditionally would look after you are not looking after your needs and not caring for you and not being the idea of the greater, idea of a family that is nurturing and fostering in some way, and how finding found family can be just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the people you are born to and around. And so I really appreciate this movie having a very different kind of, if not always like hammered home, a very different take on things. And even if it's not something that a lot of kids necessarily pick up in the explicit, I appreciate just the sheer ability to lay it out there for kids to interpret. The more variety you can get in front of kids, the more perspective that you can get in front of kids, I think is always the better. There's a lot of kids out there who only know a few things, and it's only what their direct family taught them. Anyway, that's a tangent unto itself. But there's a lot of sort of themes and tones in here that I think are very unique for kids films, for Disney films, and for animation. And I really appreciate that is very unique, even within those libraries. There's a lot of other things that are really interesting about this, and it's the context in which it was released and the production of it. As far as I'm aware, this is one of Disney's last kind of traditionally made 2D animation films. And that's kind of curious. This is coming off of the Disney Renaissance, or what's called the Disney Renaissance, which was sort of in the 90s. I think it was technically started like 89 or something like that. And for some reason is apparently not considered to be part of the Disney Renaissance. I can kind of understand why, but I kind of don't as well. Because the only two Disney animated movies that are traditionally animated, I think, in the 2000s are this and The Emperor's New Groove. The Emperor's New Groove notoriously went through a very rough production and was produced for like 7 years or something ridiculous. And was kind of wacky for a whole bunch of reasons. It also didn't perform particularly well at the box office. This, meanwhile, as I understand it, was fairly under budgeted and was not expected to do super well. Did pretty okay, but not like extraordinarily well. And it came out in the context of a lot of other 3D movies that were coming out from Disney and others. I believe this was even like up against Ice Age. I think I saw somewhere that it released at the same time as Ice Age, but I might be mistaken on that. And hold on, I gotta double check this because I can't even remember. So, yeah, okay, Brother Bear. Side tangent for another second. Brother Bear, I remember seeing Brother Bear in theaters and thinking it was not particularly good. I think Brother Bear is the one other movie that came after that it was traditionally animated by Disney. But I also don't know, the lines get blurry when it comes to animation techniques. But it is not an explicitly 3D movie, and pretty much everything else that Disney released in the 2000s and beyond that, for the most part, was not traditionally animated. Wait, when did the frog? Oh, maybe I'm wrong. The Princess and the Frog is 2009. Okay, just barely in the 2000s by a couple of days. Anyway, okay, tangents. My point was here, this was up against a lot of pressure from Disney and the larger industry to exist. And it's a whole other video, it's a whole other series of videos for me to talk about my particular history with kids movies and animated kids movies, and how 3D animation was coming into its own at this time. I am just going to say that at the time, Pixar was already massively successful, making completely computer generated graphics, and was like, with basically no competition, the best in the business by far. Everybody else was trailing them, including Disney, who eventually bought them out of frustration and envy, I'm going to say. I'm not unbiased on this. And so Disney was releasing a lot of computer-generated animated films throughout this entire era, and were really ramping it up right about the time this movie released. A lot of those films were still at that point more expensive to make, as I understand it, than the traditionally animated films. And that would soon change, like within a few years of this movie releasing, which is basically why very few traditionally animated films have come out since then. So I love that this movie exists, and it would be devastating to me if it wasn't done in a traditional style, or at least it would be a very different kind of film. I love so much of the production of this film. In particular, one of the things that caught my eye immediately is the painterly style of so much of the backgrounds and animations. While a lot of the actual animation itself is done fairly rudimentary, actually. In fact, excludes shading a lot of the time. I didn't necessarily notice it until it was pointed out to me when I was reading later. But they apparently deliberately picked a lot of scenes to be in darkness because they literally could not afford to do shadowing on a lot of characters and situations. So they just made it so they didn't have to for the most part. Where was I going with this? But my point, so a lot of the actual animation itself is fairly basic in its styles and a lot of its animation features. But the animations themselves are fantastically smooth and stretchy and bouncy and satisfying in so many ways. And these are features that can exist in CGI, in 3D animation, but usually do not. The cartoonishness of the ability for 2D animation to be cartoonish is largely lost in 3D. And this even gets into, we could go on another tangent about the type of movies that are from this era that were compositing real life people with 2D animation or 3D animation. That's a whole other discussion. Maybe I'll put a pin in that one for another time. Anyway, my point is, I love the character designs that exist in here. I love the way they move. I love everything that is given so much weight and malleability to it. The characters, especially when you're dealing with like whether it's the aliens or the human beings, the way the animation allows them to stretch and move and be unreal in that cartoonish way, but still very believable. That would be, to my mind, lost if it were not done in this sort of style. To get back to my original point, the thing that caught my eye first, though, was the backgrounds, which are done in this very painterly style. I think they're watercolor. I don't know if they're actually watercolor or whether they were made actually traditionally or done digitally. It's possible to me that they could have been done either way, but I don't really know what the standards and tools were like at that time and if it could have been done digitally. But they all look fantastic, and you get a lot of shots that are close enough on that art that you can really see the sort of lightness, the softness of what that can really look like. So many scenes are made that much better, both because the landscapes or the interior shots or these other things are painted with such care for how those things look, and they make all the animations on top of them pop that much more, because the not incredibly crazy contrast, but sufficient contrast in styles really lets you appreciate one while focusing on the other. And I love that. I don't know if anything after this really came out that quite looked like that. I don't know if anybody's really done a true... This feels like the last in a very old traditional style of drawing one style on top of another and having those backgrounds be done with such care. It's not a dead style, but at least in the West, it largely is. It's something that's sort of I only see anymore either in various Asian animation styles or in very indie animators in Western countries. It's kind of a lost art, it seems, in a lot of ways. And I can understand why the skills there, the traditional art skills, have been sort of lost. But this movie is at so many times so beautiful, it really makes me reflect on those things and wish that those skills were not as rare and as lost as they often are these days. And personal feelings about the Disney Corporation, among many other media corporations, but Disney in particular, really putting their profits before artistry and not being willing to spend on a style if it wasn't the most economically viable version of things. And so there's a little bit of mournfulness to watching this and realizing that pretty much everything that would come after it would be made in a different way because it was more economically viable, and that was the deciding factor. It's so charming. I haven't even really, we're this far into it. I've just sort of been raving about it because I think it's fantastic in so many ways. I love the setting. I love how it's not just randomly or cynically put on Hawaii. It's woven into the plot, why that's so wonderfully perfect, why, Stitch being trapped on an island drives the plot itself. I love the characterization of all of the characters. All the voice actors do a great job. I love the characterization of every single person. The deliveries are fantastic. Lilo's actor's voice and mannerisms are wonderful. Like I don't actually know how old the actor was at the time, but her, she really captures that idea, the feeling of having to deal with a kid between 8 and 12 who has a lot more awareness of the world than somebody who's younger, but still retains a lot of that whimsical sense, and also the sort of distorted sense of fairness and want, and their want to be themselves, like a completely unfiltered kid. And I've worked with kids before in professional settings, and I don't really want to go back to doing that. I don't particularly like kids, but every now and then there's something like this where it reminds me, oh yeah, sometimes kids are just charming and clever in their own ways, and sometimes the world really beats on them, whether it's the adults in their lives or the kids and the other kids in their lives who make fun of them or don't accept them for whatever reason, and they just want to be themselves. And I feel like Lilo captures that amazingly. Stitch as well has like a lot of that is down to the animation and the direction of the character, but capturing the combination of a childlike naivete with sort of the feral animal type of thing, while also being kind of a trickster, kind of clever, but in a unaware, dumb sort of way sometimes. So much characterization put into a character that barely speaks throughout the film. And then, all of the characters around them, whether it's the aliens or the other Nani and the boyfriend and everybody, the Bubbles, and like every character is they're just done really, really well and written to be exactly what they need to be. And I just find them all incredibly charming. This movie has charm coming out the years, and there are things I wish it did a little bit more. I wish it delved a little bit more into the familial relationships and the actual struggles of that family structure and the poverty and that sort of thing. But like, I can't really fault it for that, because what it actually puts out is so great that it's not really missing. It's just a personal want. It would be a little bit of a different movie as a result. I'm just super charmed by this. And I really appreciate why, or at least some of the reasons why, so many people look back on it with such fondness. I'm really curious for those who watched it as kids, how much was picked up on, or how many of those like conversations were had with parents, or what the interpretations of the different relationships and the different family and all these different things had on the kids who watched it. Because I don't know, why did Disney make a remake with live action and 3D animation? 3D animation Stitch looks horrendous. That's the only thing I've seen. I saw the poster and that thing looks awful. Like, it's bordering on 3D Sonic, the original 3D Sonic that they fixed later. It just looks bad. All those movies look awful. I don't want to look at them. And that's just like two nails in the coffin in a row of the state of animation these days. Anyway, I won't go into that. Let's leave on a high note. I really like this movie. I think it's endlessly charming. I think it should be saved and watched by many, many people. And I think it will stand the many, many more years of the test of time, because it was really well considered. Thank you for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you for something else next time.